Hey. Yeah. Cool. Mine will be here too at some point, I promise. Great. Me too. I need a distraction.
How's it going, everybody? It's another week of Locally Sourced. This one's going to be different than the usual streams. We've got some bigger fish to fry today. So smoke them if you got them, and let's get into it. Today's episode, we've got Josie Pinto from the New Hampshire Youth Movement coming on. We're going to talk about a whole slew of just progressive issues, theories, stuff like that. We're going to talk about, obviously, the riots that have been happening in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, and then a number of other really egregious actions by cops against people of color. It's been super intense, and it's worth hashing that out. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. For all intents and purposes, I'm probably going to skip the local stuff today, and I just want to I want to get into this. There is a new, for anybody in Peterborough who's watching, there's obviously a new copy of the Dispatch out. Check it up. There's some updates in there that I think everybody should just sort of be privy to, and we'll talk some dates as well in the interview about upcoming things that are happening within the state, deadlines that people need to sort of keep an eye on. So, yeah, welcome to the show. Obviously, you can become a patron. Go to locally sourced at patreon.com. Although today I'd actually much prefer that folks give their money to different things, and we'll get into that as well. But definitely subscribe to us, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and I'm Larry Folger on Twitter. You can follow me if you want to keep up with my incredibly hot takes on state politics. So yeah, with that, I'm just gonna sort of get everything together, and then we'll have Josie on, and we'll just dive right into it. But something that I did want to do is that I said this in my last stream that I was going to do little nature video interludes with a beat. And so I'm going to show you guys that for now while we're waiting, and then we'll do the interview afterwards. So check this out, and we'll be back in a moment. Thanks. Okay, so everybody, here we are. Today we've got Josie Pinto from the New Hampshire Youth Movement. She's the political director. Josie, it's awesome to have you on.
Good to be here.
yeah, it's sort of the first Zoom meeting that we're doing. Obviously, I am a total noob to this. I'm sure anybody who's watching just noticed that I didn't have the audio totally unmuted the whole time. But it's, technical issues. We're working through it. But yeah, so I think, Josie, I think we got to start out by dealing with just what's going on in Minneapolis right now, mainly because it would be foolish for us to think that won't touch us here in this state at some point. If it and in many ways it already is, and people just don't know about it.
Absolutely.
So I think, something that's really, really big and important about all of this is that we really need to I think it's time we all take a really hard look at what role police are playing in our society. And when I think about what I'm seeing happening nationwide, and then I think about the relationships that we have with our police here in this state, it's really tight community, hey, these are my friends, don't speak bad, they're making sure that we're staying safe and all that. And I hear that, but at the same time, that's a really great way to lay the groundwork for them really controlling us if something were to go wrong. And I'm just sort of wondering, as the director of the New Hampshire Youth Movement, where do you guys stand on the role of police right now?
Yeah, definitely great question. Well, we definitely consider ourselves to be part of the working class, people of color led movement. Even though here in New Hampshire we are a very predominantly white state, we definitely situate ourselves a part of the larger movement. So obviously we stand with Black lives and Black led organizations on the ground right now, really doing the work. Shout out to Dream Defenders, who have been doing it for a long time, and then a lot more state-based orgs that have just been doing this work forever. We believe in restorative justice, and that communities should be able to deal with the problems in their way and really center those impacted. And unfortunately, that's just not the state of the police state that we live in right now. And I think one thing that really shows this is how we've had the Reopen New Hampshire rallies happening here, which have been white led, absolutely no police violence, not even a single arrest made. And they've been gathering in large spaces. Meanwhile, Black folks do the same, and they're tear gas and brutalized. And just what a contradiction.
Right. Well, and I think to that end, it's really important to point out, and this kind of gets into police demilitarization stuff. But something that I think is worth pointing out is, we're talking about we're using tear gas on our citizens, which is actually banned by the Geneva Conventions in warfare. And we're kind of crossing this line. And I've seen a lot of people that want to attack sort of the protesters for throwing rocks at the cops or whatever. And one distinction that I want to make is that there have definitely been instances within the past, with this week, where certain protesters definitely started that kind of thing. But it's important to acknowledge that yesterday specifically, the Minneapolis police fired tear gas first. That was a peaceful protest, and that went south not because of unruly protesters, but because the police really just kind of jumped the gun on it. And at that point, it's really, and I can't help but think about the LA riots
Mm-hmm.
when I see, like last night, I'm just like, it's late, I'm scrolling through Twitter, there's just stream after stream popping up, and I'm trying to remember the name of the documentary specifically, but there's a really, really good documentary on the LA riots that has just, it's basically all found footage. And when I think about that documentary and I look at the footage that I saw last night, I'm really reminded of just how we really have made no gains at all, and how the most notable difference that I see is the incredible police response. That was the big difference to me when I look at the footage from the LA riots, where it's a lot of people angry as hell, and rightfully so, about Rodney King. But that organically happened out of the frustration. There were peaceful protests here, and it really devolved quickly. And I think here in the state of New Hampshire, there have been so many reports of, like, oh, cops get Bearcats now. And like, we're just taking decommissioned military equipment and just selling it to the police. And, and even libertarians seem to be kind of not too pleased with that concept. And when I think about, okay, how do we respond to police in that sense? What would be a way, like if we were to spitball ideas about what a replacement for police would be, what do you think that might look like?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, I think the biggest problem, I mean, not the biggest because there's so many, but one of the big things with this issue is just the amount of funding they're given. The amount of money we pour into the military industrial complex, police forces, and the lack of money we have for, mental health resources and giving people, a universal basic income, which is really like how we would address the root of a lot of the problems we're seeing. A lot of this is like reactionary at this point, but if we focus in on the root of a lot of things, like, I know, the looting that happened last night and stuff like that, like if we were just giving people the things they need to survive and the ability to address issues as a community and center those harmed and ask them, what does justice look like for you? I think that would do so much good, because right now, when it goes into the hands of judges and police and the people who weren't actually involved in any incident, um, a jury or whatever of your peers that don't know you, I just don't think like that is how like true justice gets served. And I don't really think, yeah, putting people in jail for lifetime based on one thing they did is really the way to do it. We know that they're not places of true rehabilitation. We know that, it really just separates families, tears them apart. And yeah, I just want to live in a world where we can figure out what just consequences for actions looks like without locking people up and separating them from, the public for the rest of their lives. So that's definitely something I believe in. I've considered myself a prison abolitionist for many years now, thanks to reading people like Angela David and some of the great scholars on this issue. So that's definitely my own personal stance. And I know that there's a lot of good restorative justice circles and practices happening across the country on like pretty hyper local levels. So I would love to just see some more state or even like nationwide initiatives like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really, I think the point that something that I take away from that's really important is the notion of local responsibility, and this idea of ground up, and sort of taking responsibility for your community as a community to deal with the problems that you've got. And I think it's important to, like, the thing that I always notice about crime or whatever you want, like whatever drives people into that, it's usually linked to some sort of sense of lack of purpose within your world, right? Or within your community. So the more likely we are to maybe resist something is related to just how disenchanted we feel with those who are around us and what they're saying or doing, and how we are interacting with them. And I always think that community can be a really positive way to bring people in and reduce that, because it's like, it's not unlike saying we're going to treat addiction like a health crisis rather than a crime problem, you know?
Yeah. One initiative I just want to shout out that I would love to see all over. There's this group called Lit that we are in affiliation with that worked to get the police out of schools and replace them with mental health counselors instead. And it was like just an incredible campaign on a local level that I would love to personally see as a response to this. Thinking a lot about, the school shootings we've seen in history too, and just increase in shootings in general. And yeah, how if that was just replaced by, more solid mental health care, which we know is so underfunded and lacking in our country. I just really wonder how much of a difference that would make in particular.
Yeah, I do too. I couldn't agree more. And I want to make sure that I get a link from you for this, the description after that. I want to make, like, everybody go check out all the stuff that we're talking about here, because education is really like one of the first ground level things that we can do to make sure that we get what we're looking for, because how do we seek what we want if we don't even know how to ask for it? So yeah, I think, that's a huge aspect of it. Something I want to move on a little bit here to this concept of, if you go and look at social media right now, everybody is losing it over looting, right? Like, that's a big fixation that people are having with what happened last night. And I think it's worth examining the concept of looting. So rather than rant more myself about it, Josie, why don't you tell us what your view on looting within this context is?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I'm surprised it's even taken this long in the pandemic to see that happening, because I see it as a pretty natural response to how overwhelmingly horrible like our capitalist system is. We all know that a one-time check of $1,200 isn't nearly enough to, fix the financial despair that so many people are going through right now. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people we know didn't even get that stimulus check. Undocumented folks, college students, a lot of people who needed it the most were left out entirely. We don't know when the next round is coming. And I think, yeah, we've seen that overall, our Congress does not always have the best interests at heart, especially Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump there. So I think for me, I just see like, yeah, looting as a pretty natural response to the state of the world that we're in. And people, I don't know if it was necessarily people trying to meet their basic needs last night, but people are rightfully angry with, the government's response. And I think that we see big corporations as the target to really place a lot of our anger at, because they've been consistently bailed out throughout this crisis. They're doing just fine. A lot of them are even making more money, now that we have been seeing that Jeff Bezos from Amazon is close to being the world's first like trillionaire. Like, that headline in the face of this pandemic, I think really tells you a lot about how we're still continuing to prioritize big corporations over people. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand with it. I definitely am in solidarity with, you know, people who took action last night. And yeah, I think they have a lot of just anger at this moment. So
And I,
yeah.
something just to like sort of tack on at the end of that, referring to corporations, is like, I, if you look at where the damage was done, realistically, it was all like AutoZone, Target,
Yeah.
McDonald's, like this.
They'll be fine.
Right. And that's a distinction that I think folks would be wise to make when, like, I said earlier, like I brought up the LA riots, that was a lot of like private, small mom and pop businesses.
Yeah.
Not the same thing as what went on last night. So I know that people will do their best to equate those things, and they're not. The places that were destroyed realistically are not. They're not going to be drastically hurt by that. And to an effect of the buildings themselves, through my own personal research into like housing sustainability and creating structures that last versus ones that are temporary, most of those companies, when they go and they build those box stores, right, they're not planning on those buildings even standing within 20 years. So it's not truly heartbreaking when they go to the ground. Yeah.
No, they're also very insured. And I think one of the most interesting things, I've learned about looting, stealing is that it's actually fully covered by insurance of companies, and they get a huge tax break for anything that was stolen. So, in reality, like they're not actually losing money either. You think that they are, but that's not even how it works. So,
right.
yeah.
And that's huge. Like that's totally, that's massive. You know what I mean? That's a really big part of it. There's not really a lot of personal harm happening in that
Exactly.
that room. So yeah, I really wanted to sort of take that moment to touch on sort of like this weird way that we capitalize on ourselves. And like we were talking earlier, and I had mentioned, like there was a framing that I had seen where someone described it as a way to reclaim our own value by devaluing the objects that have been placed in priority above our own lives within our society.
Yep.
And that goes along with a lot of the stuff that I really want to be trying to do on this stream too, is to help try and reframe the concept that that everybody just seems to blindly accept sometimes about the way things are, and to consider that maybe we're not looking at shades of gray that exist.
Yeah.
So to move on from this sort of like grimmer topic, I do want to get to sort of the more personally related stuff. So the New Hampshire Youth Movement, your website calls for automatic voter registration, making election days holidays, free and accessible internet. It's a big move to stop voter suppression, among other things. Can you talk at all about the strategies NHYM plans to use for reducing voter suppression in this state, like in public elections, and then what are some of the approaches that you guys have working inside the two-party system? Because I know that at this point in time, there's a lot of breakdown, especially for young folks and millennials and Gen Z, Gen Z, who are really feeling hurt and lost at their futures, and how they feel in many ways betrayed by both parties. So yeah, if you talk about some of that would be great.
Yeah, and I'd love to date this back even a few years, because New Hampshire Youth Movement was majorly thrown off in our work by a bill called HB 1264, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which really was a direct attack on college students, who we know often make up the margin of victory here in New Hampshire. And as an organization that primarily turns out college students, we really saw this as a hugely personal attack by the GOP to really tell young people, like, no, we don't want your voices being heard. And I just get so angry when I think about our state simultaneously saying, oh, we need and want young people, and then telling out of state college students, actually, no, your vote doesn't count here. We don't want you to invest in, our local political scene. And I think it's so personal for me because when I was in college, getting involved in local politics in Western Mass, which I'm not even from Western Mass, I'm from upstate New York, but being able to get involved in my, you know, local political sphere there, I worked on a local state reps race. It really gave me, you know, the passion that I have today for politics. And so I just think like we're denying just personal investment of young people in our state by telling them they can't vote here. So yeah, I just see that whole thing as really personal. And it feels like, you know, on one hand, yes, we're fighting for fair and open elections, but we're still in the fight for ensuring we can even vote at all. And I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost in this. You know, the lawsuit that the ACLU is doing is still sort of concluding at this point, and it has just been the most confusing thing. You know, there are people who have been lawyers for many years who can't understand this bill right now. And yeah, so just wanted to talk about that a little. But I think in general, one of the other reflections I've had is that the past few elections I've seen in New Hampshire, you know, being at the polls, in college towns, there are lines out the door for same day voter registration. We know that, you know, most young people who go to the polls, a lot of them have not registered in advance. A lot of them don't have much time to do so. And so we always tell them, you know, make sure, you know, you know that you and all your friends can register right there. And I'm really concerned about that this coming year, just because we know that, you know, the crowds that we see are going to be pretty unsafe. But at the same time, I also have concerns with switching entirely over to vote by mail, because I know it's going to inherently leave some people out, namely college students. So I also want to make sure that safe in-person practices aren't left out of this as we talk about vote by mail, because I know that, yeah, like college students are just not going to turn out to vote if we entirely lose an in-person option. But right now, our Secretary of State, you know, who's been in office over 40 years and his website is pretty outdated and clunky, um, we need to make sure that by the time September primary comes, we have online voter registration, which we're not even sort of close to having right now. That's a huge one for us. So that people can just go to the polls or vote by mail safely. And then I think the other big piece we really have to work on is there's going to be a huge education campaign that needs to be run, especially with the current state of absentee ballots. So, as it's stated right now, if you request an absentee ballot, you actually have to check off disability as your reason for choosing an absentee ballot. And so they have expanded the definition of disability to, you know, include fear of getting sick due to a health crisis or actual sickness. But it's not going to be natural instinct for a lot of people to check off the box disability when that is not an identity that they've ever held before. And so I'm
Yeah.
really concerned about that framing and language and who that's going to leave out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think, you know, to me too, that gets into this concept of like the like virtually any social program that we have or anything that we do to help folks, we inject it with so much means testing. And like I really feel like that comes in a lot of ways from Democrats who are trying to not just have their bills get tanked by Republicans. And the result is you know, we get something that's a real half measure and makes people feel alienated when they go to get the help. I mean, I've personally spoken about my own experiences with the unemployment in this state, and you know, like their questions are really rough. Like it's just it kind of puts you through the ringer, and it's just it leaves a bad feeling. And I think, you know, if you look at some of the stuff that's been proposed in, you know, the national context, like the Sanders Markey bill that was calling for just $2,000 a month until this is over. I mean, like that just hops right over the entire "do you qualify for unemployment" thing. You know, it's ridiculous. Something that I caught this morning as I was sort of like getting everything ready is the ACLU has actually pulled the lawsuit regarding 1264.
1264.
Yeah. And And I'm actually gonna try and put it up on the stream screen here. I can't do it on a Zoom share, but I just want to show everybody who's watching. We've got it up top right now. This is an article on WMUR where it says Gardner praises end to 8-year ordeal over New Hampshire voting requirements. And it's like, I think Bill Gardner has been a really like interesting character in all of this. And they've got him quoted here saying, "We have lived through 8 years of this starting in 2012, this question of residence and domicile." And they never cleared that up. Like, I always hate pointing this out to people, but these days semantics matter. We have gotten to a point in our society where things are just so detailed that literally the words you choose do matter. And if you're not willing to make distinction about something, then we default to kind of like saying no rather than saying yes, right? So we're saying no to college students who are spending 9 out of 12 months here, if not all 12 months,
giving us a lot of their money.
Right, exactly. It's crazy. And just kind of shutting them out, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems really wishy-washy for, and kind of like pearl clutchy on Gardner's part, where he's just like so glad this is over, and it's just been really horrible what they've done, and it hasn't been fair to Sununu, where we're the state that has the most relaxed laws when it comes to out-of-state voters. And it's like, hey, let's maybe remember that mentioning every other state is worse than us doesn't change the scenario. When you make progress, you then have to change the floor that you're starting on.
Yeah.
If you're constantly saying, well, look how far we've come, then you're not gonna make any more progress.
Right. And I think it's also worth noting, New Hampshire Youth Movement was actually born out of this fight because we heard about this legislation coming, and we knew that it was going to hit Governor Sununu's desk. And so we actually recorded a bird dog video with him and one of our members, Ben, who famously asked him how he felt about the bill and if he would sign it if it came to his desk. And he told us to our faces, no, I would never sign it. Everyone deserves to vote. And that video went absolutely viral. And out of that moment, they were literally like on a napkin writing our potential new logo. Like they came out of that time with him and just realized we got to do this. So it's just a really personal thing to us because our governor lied to our faces. And, ever since that, if we try to go to his events, we're immediately recognized, told to leave. They definitely know us as players in this fight. We actually last May also had a huge sit-in at both his office and Gardner's office. 10 of our members were arrested for refusing to leave the state house. And yeah, we really wanted to make our voices heard. It was the last few days of school wrapping up last May. And we just wanted to make sure we didn't go down without a fight. So it's been really great to be with a group that situates ourselves there. I feel really happy that I've found my people that are willing to make their voices heard in this fight for sure. But yeah, I just wanted to note that without this in particular problem, I don't even know if we would have formed as an organization. So
yeah, and I think something else that I observe outside of that when I think about the reopen protests that have happened recently. Like you just pointed out that you guys are getting arrested on a fairly regular basis, and this is work that I know 350 does too, and and Sunrise, and everybody is really I notice that the left is really, really good at this. We're good at accepting being arrested, right? And I think, if you look at what the left has been through globally and historically, that's like we've just been beaten down by the cops all the time. Look at last night. But the right really is like those guys have a hard time grappling with this concept of like, you know, we're really gonna have to prepare ourselves to get arrested here. Like, you're gonna have to crack an egg. And so just for anybody on the left, I want to point out that like that's something that we've really got going for us, is that group solidarity that allows us to go out and deal with getting arrested. And I, you know, that's huge. That's a step that we're willing to take to push back against an oppressive government in a lot of ways, or an oppressive system, an oppressive capitalist system. I think those two are inexorably tied together, and something that often gets missed by libertarians in the state is that that's actually fighting for liberty. Right?
Absolutely.
Like it's fighting for the rights of us as individuals to not get messed with, and to not have our votes taken away from us, and to have clean air and any number of other issues. So
definitely.
So I think to sort of dovetail on that, something that we see with growing everywhere politically right now, and is sort of the hot topic, is populism. And it seems to be a core of a lot of youth political movements, right and left alike. Older generations typically, you know, are quick to bring up the Soviet Union and caution against populism or populist movements. You know, they have a much less favorable opinion of it, related to their own experience and historical understandings. So where do you feel like the balance between populist and anti-populist forces is at? Or are we at this point now where we're not going to be able to reconcile that, and reaching across the aisle is less important than trying to draw a clear and distinct boundary for ourselves to build off of?
I think that's a great question. When I talk about populism, I think the first thing that I think is really important to point out is that there's two main forms that it takes. So there's inclusionary populism, which we see Bernie Sanders emulate. And really what inclusionary populism looks like is, you know, pulling in all underrepresented people, building those bridges, incorporating, you know, their views and stances into your platform. You know, that is what we consider inclusionary populism, building people up. Donald Trump is someone who emulates exclusionary populism. So instead of building up, he punches down. And what that looks like is uniting people around, you know, what he considers to be like the common enemies. But it really doesn't work to build bridges. And just in his messaging in general, it's very aggressive, pushy, rude, as opposed to, you know, kind, lifting people up. So the actual messaging looks pretty opposite of each other, but they're both populism, because you're still trying to, you know, get a huge group of people to follow you in some way. It's just, you know, different strategies and messages through that. So we definitely situate ourselves in the inclusionary populism category, where we want to be building bridges with, you know, other organizations that have similar values and missions as us. And I think in terms of the whole, you know, working across the aisle thing and all that, the thing that's different about young people, you know, we are both the largest voting bloc and the most progressive generation in history. I think we just have a standard for what we consider basic human rights to be. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party as a whole does not always respect those basic human rights, being, you know, the right to healthcare and food and shelter. So even though it, you know, we're said that our views are progressive and radical for calling for things like free healthcare and free housing and food justice for all, we really don't see it that way, just because we're really like solid in the idea that these are basic human rights. So to be honest, I'm not as concerned about reaching across the aisle right now when we know that harm is being done by both the Democrat and Republican parties. And, there's countless examples of that. I don't need to tell you, but I think one thing that's been really interesting for me to watch is, I guess, going into this pandemic, I expected more of our politicians to get radicalized through it, and that has not happened at all. I, was on a call with some staff of one of our senators the other day, and I asked about, would she consider supporting Medicare for all anymore, or at least working to get uninsured and unemployed people onto the Medicare system? And their response was, no, she believes in subsidizing Cobra, which, as we know, is like a horrible
Are you
system
kidding
that,
me? Like,
yeah,
oh my God.
yeah. And so I just am
Ugh.
so sick of having faith in people and believing in, the goodness of human nature, and then just being so constantly disappointed by so many elected officials who aren't even seeing this as an opportunity to help people who are, suffering. And in all this, like, we're not talking about the fact that we have both a healthcare and an unemployment crisis, and so many people's employment is what gives them insurance. And so there's so many people who, yeah, have lost their jobs, might have COVID, and like don't even know if they should go to the hospital because they don't know if they can pay the bills when, they do. So yeah, those are just some of the things running through my mind right now. And I don't see why working across the aisle should be a huge priority when we still have so much work to do on the left to even push our Democrats to support basic human rights.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's super super crucial to point out, and I think if anybody actually wants to take some time to sort of like dig back into like the history of the way Democrats act in this state, I mean, like, look, the pledge is kind of like the shining example of how like there can be very little daylight between the Democrats and the Republicans in New Hampshire. I think another sort of touchstone on that issue is, say, legalizing marijuana. Like, there's
so much missed revenue.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like, look, it's fair to point out to people that you're talking about, like, some people will say, well, oh, why would we need an income tax? Let's just legalize marijuana and we'll just tax that and that'll pay for everything. And that's something for folks to understand, is that that's the difference between millions and billions, right? Like,
yeah,
like marijuana revenue will be in the tens of hundreds of millions, whereas broad-based taxes like a property tax, income tax, sales tax, that gets you billions. That pays for real meaningful stuff. Now, like, we can take those tens and hundreds of millions from marijuana and we can reinvest it into a lot of really good stuff, but it's not a replacement for a broad-based tax. So just to like, I just want to sort of sidebar what I'm talking about here with that, because like it's important to understand contextually that like that's just not it's not a substantial replacement. But the point being is that, yes, it's still just a copious amount of missed revenue. Like, it's ridiculous. And furthermore, to anybody who cares about like their individual rights, that is an infringement on your right to just do what you want to do. I mean, it's a plant, man. It like I don't understand why we can't just let it all go.
yeah.
But in a lot of ways, it shows me that there's like once people get into the state house, there's so much focus on decorum and just sort of like, well, we got to work together. And I understand that, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do in a sense, but to sacrifice helping people as much as you can to like be nice to somebody seems a little absurd.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm not saying there shouldn't ever be bipartisan effort when that bridge is already formed, but I think people place just too much of a focus on making it work and end up compromising on some pretty serious values in the process. So I think that's kind of where I and us as an organization, we draw a line when our values are compromised. So yeah.
And I think that's like to one of my more previous questions. I think that's like the real important takeaway, and what I find really distinguishes particularly youth movements, especially on the left, that like there's this like, no, excuse the language, but we're not going to take your bullshit. Like,
yeah,
it's, like I refuse this categorically, and you got to come back and you got to give me something better.
Yeah.
That's just like, if you look at what the Tea Party did with, and related to Occupy and all that, like that worked. And I think it's really refreshing to see young people on the left looking at that period of time that, like, a lot of us came of age during Occupy, and really, like, the Snowden revelations were just incredible for us. And, looking at what happened with the Panama Papers, and it's like, this is what we grew up with, right? Like, it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my first memory that I like vividly remember is 9/11, when I was 5 years old and living in New York. So it was my second day of kindergarten, and I had to hide under a desk. So I think, like, when you start your education, like, on that note, my mom used to work in the Trade Center towers, and I don't know, I just feel like my whole life has really just been like one crisis after another. And I think that that's really a huge part of why our generation is the most progressive generation, just sheerly through what we've lived through and how we've seen our elected officials respond to these things.
Yeah, and I think the democratization, or sort of like, the ubiquitous nature of information on the internet really helped us a lot in that sense. Like, yeah, it's kind of like looking into the sun all day, every day. But but the flip side of that is that a lot of us are just sort of inherently critical of, say, cable news. And I don't want to like get all super MSME right now about it, but it's like, but there is a certain amount of like, look, those are major corporations. The way they pass us information is very much so suited to making sure that their bottom line is secure. It's like, for, obviously you've got major networks broadly, but it's important for folks to remember, like, hey, look, MUR is owned by Hearst, and they exercise a lot, and I mean a lot, of editorial control over what happens on that station. If you go and just sort of flip through their YouTube uploads, I swear, like 1/3 of it is like crime videos, and and it's like, and most of it's not like white collar crime. The people that they're posting in these videos are, low income, maybe they're addicted to drugs, they're people of color. Like, it's reinforcing this really horrible stereotype, when, if you want to go back to the looting concept, like, the rich people have been looting us for decades. Like, they've been looting the working class for decades.
That's a great way to look at it. Stealing wages, and
right.
I mean,
and
for sure.
So it's like, when there's this sort of level of outrage from people who have power, it's like, I'm over this idea of them trying to say, how dare you be above it? Like, no, we're not it's not about being above it. It's that nothing, like, every time that a lot of these movements try to rise above these problems, we just get pushed down further. And after a certain point, you gotta take a no BS line and just stand your ground.
For sure. Yeah.
So let's see here. I want to we got like one more question, and then we'll take off for the day. So I think, do you see us being able to create stronger ties with more independently libertarian type voters? Do you see there being a way to reach out to that? I had done a sort of a review of a segment last week of a libertarian type podcast with Joel Valenzuela and my local RNC chairman, Chris Maidman, and they were talking about how they were just like, they're Edelblue guys, and they're like just at a point where they're totally fed up with Sununu. They're like, he's tanked our economy. Everything good that he did has been completely undone by his capitulation to, the worry science or whatever that they, however they want to frame it. And they're over it with him, and they feel really infringed upon. And I like, whether we agree with them or not, it's like, they were willing to kind of step out and say, hey, maybe we got to accept a Democratic governor for a term if we're going to, get what we want. And I, obviously I want to sort of like point out, I'm not endorsing the Free State Project, right? Like,
yeah,
like at all, because they've harbored neo-Nazis, they've harbored pedophile excusers.
For sure.
The movement itself, based off of Soren's original text, was formulated on like, we want to secede from the Union, which is a really bad look. So I want to be clear that I'm not condoning that. But it is, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge left libertarianism in this state, and to try and at least like have some sort of introspection or autopsy of that interaction that we have with our more populist counterparts on the other side of things, that would still say, like, I'm an independent voter. I don't necessarily always go to the Republicans. Yeah, I vote for them when it suits me, but, like, if we can meet up on issues like police demilitarization right now, I don't see what the problem is. So I'm just wondering what your stance on that is.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great question. I think it's important to point out that the opposite of libertarianism is authoritarianism. And so if we're opposing, like the massive amounts of authority in which the state and government has been wielding, I think it's important to recognize that there are certain issues that it is okay to, think through working together with. I think some differences, though, that I just want to point out is that, libertarians, well, a lot of them are like, socially progressive. It's the fiscal issues that seem to be a huge barrier. They don't believe in government funded like anything. Like, yeah, they don't believe in welfare systems. And so I think it's important to balance that a lot of our core beliefs are very different, because we believe it's the government's duty to help people. And they are just so individualistic in their mindset, and, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, which I'd say we are very distant from. So I think a side thing I do outside of the New Hampshire youth movement, I started an abortion fund here in New Hampshire. And I think that, to me, is the perfect example of a place that I would love to build the bridge with the Libertarian Party, because I know that we share a core belief in reproductive rights. So when it comes to like a case by case issue, I'm definitely open to those bridges. But would I say, let's, fully integrate our ideas and build, in a more long-term sustainable way together?
Yeah.
Probably not, because it comes back to those compromising of values that I'm not in favor of. So
right.
Yeah.
And that's a really good sort of thing to indicate right there, is like, we will like the openness to work, but it's like, that has absolutely nothing to do with what we were talking about earlier with compromising values. And, like, the thing that the real challenge that I see the left having, especially a young populist left in response to a more young populist right, is the idea of like, okay, so these guys aren't for big social programs, right? They're super against like the government doing anything. And oftentimes they're sort of like, we'll put it all into private, right? And for me, I think about like, okay, well, yeah, but we don't have any authority over private ownership, right? Like
Right.
nobody can come in and say anything about how somebody really runs their business aside from that person really breaking egregious laws. But I mean, anybody knows. I don't know a single person that hasn't been in a toxic work environment at some point. So, and those businesses just continue to thrive anyway. So it's not like having problems in your workplace mean you all of a sudden shouldn't have a business anymore. You know what I mean? Like, the point being is, like, there's no authority that we as people, as workers, have over those folks. And the government itself is like government as a word is really just sort of like talking about a representation of people in our country by a democratic means, right? So those people are directly accountable to us. Like, we give them their jobs and we can take them away too, right? So the thing I always want to sort of frame to that libertarian side, and I think is like an argument that maybe we on the left could engage with a little more, is like, well, isn't that kind of a breach of your personal rights? Like, do you really feel like it's okay for a private company who you have no authority over to come in and, I mean, what was it in the case of Hampstead? It was like there was a company that was pulling water out of the ground and selling it, and then all of a sudden the town water went dry because the aquifer was connected. You know, like...
Yeah. Or Hobby Lobby telling their employees that they can't get birth control. Like,
right. You know, it's like there's a lot of stuff here, and it's like, how is that any better? You know what I mean? And like,
yeah,
let's have a reframe of like, look, most of us don't want massive government either, because a lot of the problems that the left takes with the government right now is the back scratchy, like, crony capitalist bureaucracy that really kneecaps any kind of progress at all. So on that, we relate. And, you know, it's like that needs to be the focus, and that's more a function of private enterprise than it is of governmental enterprise. And I think, like, having open and fair elections, you know, like that kind of thing, when we're going through a primary process, to not spend the time focusing on your opponent that you might be facing in the general, but like focus on distinguishing yourself from the people you're running against within your primary. Like, let's really use democracy the way it's supposed to be used. And I think we'd find that we preserve a lot more of those base liberties, and we can have things like paid family medical leave, and we can have things like Medicare for all, and still have a relatively small government, because maybe we just like stopped going to war with countries that we don't need to go to war with because we want their oil. Like,
yeah.
So at any rate, Josie, thanks so much for coming on today. This has been like, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm just like, I'm really excited for what New Hampshire Youth Movement has going right now. Anybody you want to shout out here at the end? Any links you want to tell us about, organizations? We wanted to make sure, and I'll put this up on the screen now, that we've got the Black Visions Collective here, and for anybody to just please go and donate to them, not us today.
Yeah.
It's, you know, with everything that's going on right now, it's really important that folks be helping the workers, the families, the people that are of colors that are getting really screwed over. And we need to have that solidarity right now.
Yeah, my biggest thing is just donate to the local groups that are really on the ground, you know, doing the work, especially when faced with such violence. I think a lot of people tend to, you know, spend their money donating to these big, larger, white-led national organizations that still do good work, but there's just so much more of an impact that local money can have. So yeah, I think it's just really important to directly support organizations on the ground, you know, when we see such injustices. occur. So definitely Black Visions Collective would be my call for right now, but I could name a dozen other local orgs that are worth donating to. I also recently became a monthly donor to Dream Defenders, who is, probably the youth-led group I'm most excited about right now, that's really on the edge of, revolutionary concepts. So definitely we, look to them for a lot of guidance in, how that informs our work. They're in Florida, so much different landscape than we have here in New Hampshire. But just because we're a primarily white state doesn't mean we're not still, in solidarity with groups like that over a lot of groups here in New Hampshire that are white led. So yeah, support those when you can.
Awesome. Well, again, Josie, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a total pleasure, and I hope we can meet up again and talk soon.
Yeah.
Love to have you
Carter.
back on. Yeah, no problem. So hey, take care, and we'll catch up soon.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. All right, folks. So for today, as for I Josie's really cool, and she really knows what's up, and I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to follow the New Hampshire youth movement. They just collaborated with Rights and Democracy not that long ago on COVID-19 People's Bailout Town Hall. Definitely go check that out. There's a lot of good stories, a lot of good understanding of, the organizations within our state that you can get involved in or you can do research with to help affect change here locally. And as Josie said, make sure that we are putting our money in the right place. Or her point about not, there's big white led organizations that are sort of, that people give a lot of money to. She's right. That's not the place to put it. If you want to be a good, true progressive, then and one that has that populist identification, the things that bind us, not the things that separate us, right? If you really want to do that, then take that extra time to go and look up, the specific organizations in those areas that will make a real impact on their direct communities. When we think about how much it means to us when our towns or whatever, when we get grants that help us fix things, or in the case of Peterborough, we've finally been able to repair our downtown bridge, and that's been huge. Anything like that. I mean, and not to say that was done independently, but the idea is like local money makes a way bigger difference. Local investment makes a way bigger difference, whether you're doing that in your own community or you're doing it to help out another community somewhere else. We can think globally and we can act locally, and that's crucial. So, with that, I think we're going to end the stream for today. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. I plan on having more people on. I've been talking with, as people may have heard over an earlier interlude, I've been talking with Sherry Frost. I'd really like to have her on, talking with Emmett Soldati, who's running for executive council. I'd really like to have him on. Somebody else I'd really like to speak with, Carlos Cardona. And then also I have actually personally spoken to Joelle Valenzuela, and it sounds like we are going to try and have a talk too about some of the stuff that we can agree on, some things that we can work together on. And, again, it's like what I want to set things apart here a little bit on this stream and try and talk about some of this philosophy and try and talk about some of this understanding of our issues and what we all deal with and what we all go through. Because it's you know, education is key, and understanding what we're doing, what we're dealing with, knowing what challenges we face and what we actually need to do to get there, right? That's first and foremost. You know, you got a lot of voter education stuff that needs to be happening. Something we didn't quite get to, but we've got deadlines coming up, folks. I think it's, let me see here. See here. Yeah, June 2nd is the last day to change your party affiliation before the 2020 primaries. So if you are one of those independent leaning libertarians, if you, for whatever reason, decided you were going to vote Republican last time or what have you, or decided you were going to vote Democrat and you want to weigh in on the other side, we're running out of time for that to switch. And if you want to have a real say in that and not get kind of pigeonholed into a specific ballot that you don't want to vote on, make sure to get in touch with your town clerk's office and change that with them. That's really, really important. As Josie said, you know, educating voters on how to vote during this pandemic is just top tier important. And it's the biggest challenge that anybody will be facing dealing with this, especially at a time where we've already experienced really low voter turnout in this election. You know, in many ways that was what, you know, won here in New Hampshire, but in many ways that was what hurt Bernie Sanders was a lack of turnout. It definitely played a big role. I don't know if the lack of turnout amongst young people is what sunk him per se. I think there's a lot of factors there. And I'd be happy to talk about that another time if people are interested in it, or maybe we'll have a guest on that'll weigh in on that a little better. But it's important to acknowledge that we gotta keep education up, and we gotta keep, you know, awareness and discussion of like, what does this all really mean? Like that's gotta be in the forefront of all of this. So, you know, with that, thanks everybody for tuning in today. Obviously, if you're doing well right now and you've got the cash, please support everybody that we've been talking about. You know, become a patron. Support this local media. It's, you know, these videos go up here for free. I'm not going to charge people for them because the way I see it, the information is the thing that we need. There shouldn't be any more kind of elitism in that. I try to let everybody have access to this as soon as possible. So, you know, be mindful with your money right now. Obviously, times are tight. If you can afford to help out these causes and help us out too, that's awesome. Please do it. But again, you know, Dream Defenders, Black Visions Collective. I mean, like this, as Josie said, there's so many, and we can list them all off here, but those people need the help right now. That's definitely where we should be putting the emphasis. So obviously, though, you don't have to pay a dime to follow us on Twitter. You don't have to pay a cent to like us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. So definitely do that stuff. And you can keep up with these live streams. You can keep up with the clips that we post if you feel like the live streams are just simply too much to sit through, which I know is it can be hard for some people. Once you get over like 30-40 minutes of content, you just start kind of glazing over. I get that. So at any rate, thanks so much everybody for tuning in today. It's been just this was one of my favorites so far. And it's nice to get back into the swing of having some interviews, and I really look forward to just expanding this, and I hope that we can use this as a platform going down the road to really discuss helping people and breaking down the ideas that underpin our whole society from a local perspective. Like, because honestly, this is where it's happening. And this is where we're going to, particularly for the left, this is where you're going to be able to really affect the change. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week, okay?
feeling, I think, a melodic feeling, or just say a certain kind of a thing to try to maybe show somebody something through music, even show myself something, because as I've discovered it myself, it's been a revelation.